Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Emerald City Hockey's Seattle Kraken podcast.
All right, RJ, for the cold open this week, gotta talk about the debate that is lighting the hockey world on fire, and that is about the cover of the latest NHL video game. It's not about whether or not we should all boycott and just nobody buys the NHL video game to send a message to EA that they're, doing a terrible job or anything, but it's because
that's a given.
I know, but it's because we got like the best two cover athletes we could have ever hoped for, and yet for some reason hockey fans just can't acknowledge that. And it's driving me nuts, RJ. I don't know about you, but I love the fact that Sarah Nurse and Trevor Zegras are on the cover of this thing.
I do too. It's so fun to have, athletes who are really the marketable face of the game, right? We've talked about Trevor Zegras forever, right, since he came into the league, and was so exciting about how the NHL needs to be pushing this and marketing this. And it seemed like just about everyone agreed with us, right? In the hockey sphere, especially at the All-Star game, doing those cool moves. Zegras should have won. How could you give this to the Golden Knights? Because just they're at home. This is the problem with hockey. And then you put him on the cover, which is one of the most marketable places for any NHL player, and people have a problem with it. I don't know. I don't get it.
I understand the argument of saying like, well, it should be someone from, Stanley Cup winning team or whatever. Like, I get that. I just think that, yes, when it comes to marketability, the NHL has had such a problem for so long. And the fact that their recent, like, two, generational-ish players in Connor McDavid, who lacks all personality, like, just truly. And then you have Austin Matthews, who just shave the damn mustache, man. Like, come on, help us out here just a little bit. Okay. Yeah, like, I don't know, he's not doing a great job of it either. Like, they needed an injection of energy and excitement, and guys like Trevor Zegras, Jack Hughes, you know what I mean? Like, these are the guys that can give you that and, help grow the game, especially now that you're partnered with an ESPN. Like, Zegras was all over SportsCenter top plays last year because of things. You know what I mean? Like, that's the stuff that you need if you want to grow the sport, if you want to have more fans involved in the sport, if you want to stop feeling like you're the, ugly stepchild in the sports world, which I know upsets so many hockey fans, then you got to embrace some of this stuff. And I just don't think it's a bad thing, and I especially don't think it's a bad thing because we're talking about a video game. Who is not the most video gamey player if it's not Trevor Zegras, right? Like, that's all he's doing.
Exactly. Yeah, no. In a video game, you're just trying to pull off some of the stuff that he does. I mean, that's what you're trying to do. And I think we should also talk about Sarah Nurse.
Yes.
And how great that is too. I love how the two of them kind of play off of each other and interact with each other. The personalities there are awesome, and also the more that you can bring women's hockey, and especially the international women's hockey, I love she's in the Canada gear, to the mainstream, the better. Because if you can just get more eyeballs on like those USA Canada series, that sells itself. It is such good hockey. So I love that they did that with both of them, and that they're incorporating, I think, what women's players into Ultimate Team. Is that kind of their selling point there? I don't know. I don't play the game anymore because it's terrible. But
yeah, I don't know either. But yes, I mean, in Sarah Nurse, you have a phenomenal hockey player in her own right. Someone who has, again, marketable personality. She knows how to work all that stuff. She's been great as far as helping to promote the game and promote the women's game for years now. Like, this is nothing new. And I do think that that's important. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of one of those moments where it feels like this. I'm kind of surprised it didn't happen sooner, in a way too, because the one thing that I will say about hockey when it comes to this stuff is I've always felt like NHL fans were so much better about acknowledging the women's side of the game, appreciating the women's side of the game, truly being fans of the women's side of the game than any of the other major sports leagues, right? Like, I really just in the last like 3 years, it feels like the WNBA is kind of finally breaking through to more, average mainstream NBA stuff, right? Like, but that's taken a serious push from the league, where I feel like in the hockey side, it's really been the fans all along that have just embrace the women's tournaments, all that kind of stuff. So I'm actually kind of surprised that it took so long to have a cover like this, just because I feel like hockey, more so than any of the other sports, has been primed and ready for it for the longest period of time. But better late than never, I guess.
Well done, EA, on that one little bit.
Yes.
Now just fix the gameplay, fix everything else.
Right, you get one. And yes, if the big selling point is that you're going to have female players in Ultimate Team, just look at that sentence for a moment. The problem is Ultimate Team.
Yes.
It is RNG gambling for real money. That's what that is. That's all it is, and that's where they spend all 4 developers that EA has work on this game. That's where they spend all their time. It's on Ultimate Team. So it's like a win for inclusion, but it's also like an L because why does that mode exist?
Exactly.
At the expense of franchise mode. Oh, it drives me nuts. And then finally, I just want to appreciate the fact that they did all that at Ducks Ice. I've been saying it on like Discord, on Twitter, every time they release behind the scenes stuff about the cover shoot and all that stuff. But I'm telling you, that rink is fantastic. It's the old practice facility for the Ducks. I don't think they still use it because they built a whole new system of rinks and everything down there. The one thing I will always give the Ducks credit for is the amount of investment they made in local hockey. Whether it was building a ton of rinks, there's just a ton of rinks littering OC, way more than like in LA, which doesn't make sense, even though there's far more population there. They've done a fantastic job of that. They've had a high school league that's been really successful throughout Orange County for years now that incorporates both ice and roller hockey. So I've always thought that that's cool, and they invest heavily in that to make sure that as many people can afford to participate as possible. And then just that building, the natural wood, all that stuff you can see from the behind the scenes pictures. It's where the WHL holds their USA Combine every year, and it's just fantastic. So I love it. I have lots of fond memories from those WHL Combines, from scouting there. So I was just happy to see it and happy that it gets to be on the cover of a thing. I was more excited for that than Zegras or Sarah Nurse, to be honest.
I know that place.
I know. I've been there. I've seen people there. So that's cool. But I am curious, as always, let us know, comments, Twitter, Discord, all that kind of stuff. It's been a debate that's been going around for a little while now. And yeah, I mean, would you have rather it have been a Tampa Bay Lightning player or a Colorado Avalanche player just because they're winning? Is that
both?
I know. I mean, that idea was floated on our Discord. I think that's a good idea. I love that one Madden cover. The year after the Steelers-Cardinals Super Bowl, when you had Fitz and Troy Polamalu on it, that was fantastic to me.
Yep.
Madden 10 or whatever. So, all right, there we go. Enough video game talk. Let's move into the Kraken news. RJ, with the quick hits, we've got some actual news this week. Again, like somehow these news nuggets keep trickling out for us deep into August. So we'll start with the player media availability that you had with both Andre Burakovsky and Justin Schultz, and then we'll talk about the recent front office hires that were made. But why don't you take it away with those media availabilities?
Sounds good. And a quick shout out to Kraken PR for spacing all this stuff out so we have something to talk about every week.
Yeah.
Really appreciate that. I'm sure they've got us in mind in our podcast when doing that. But thank you again to Kraken PR. So we'll start with a media availability that we had a couple days ago. And we got a couple new Kraken players, Andre Burakovsky and Justin Schultz. So we got Burakovsky first. I'll start with him. And just to start with, Burakovsky, he was fun. He was in Europe at the time. It was nighttime for him. You could tell he was under some kind of tree, and it was dark, but he took some time out of his night to talk to us. My main takeaways from the Burakovsky presser, first of all, he was kind of asked about, why was this a fit? Why did he choose to sign in Seattle? And the first thing that he mentioned was that Seattle showed interest right away. And you could really get a sense that being wanted like that was important to him. He said, when they reach out that quickly, that they want you. And he just felt like that was an important factor for him. So you could definitely tell Seattle had interest in him right away. He's someone that we kind of had drawn some lines there in free agency that it would make sense for the Kraken to be interested. And it sounds like they absolutely were. The second takeaway is that he really likes what he's seen of Seattle. and that he and his girlfriend are excited about living here. It's a decision, it sounds like the two of them kind of made together, and he said, yeah, my girlfriend in particular is really excited about living here. They've gone and checked out different areas. I believe it was it Kirkland and Bellevue that they were looking at, as far as getting a house. So they're ready to get settled down right away. They've already checked out some of the local restaurants. It seems like they're ready to embrace being in Seattle, and they're really excited about everything off the ice too, about just living here, which is great to see. I love to see when the players really embrace the area and are excited to live here.
Yeah, exactly. It's refreshing, because it's I feel like the Kraken players have talked about that a lot more than other teams, right? In the past, we've heard from free agents signing places a lot. We've heard players being traded in places a lot over the years, and you don't feel like there's that same kind of like, wow, like this city's pretty dope. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and I don't know if that's just because it was kind of off the hockey radar for a lot of people. If they weren't like a WHL player, there was kind of no reason to ever end up in Seattle for them. But it's really nice, and it is kind of refreshing because you're just not used to hearing stuff like that. And then yeah, I'm just excited to add him to the team. I feel like his signing, more so than really any other offseason move, has somehow flown under the radar when it was their biggest signing. Like, I don't know how that's kind of happened. But again, like, this is a guy who's going to come in and is going to put up a lot of points this year, and he's going to be a 20 goal scorer. And I'm really excited to see who he kind of develops chemistry with, if he finds that top line chemistry with Matty Beniers and all of those kinds of things. Because I know one of the other things he talked about was kind of not being in the shadow of all
Mm-hmm.
these players that he kind of has been throughout his career, and this is his opportunity to prove that he's his own man, so to speak, and he as a player can hang in a top line role and produce numbers like he's a top line player. And I do think that he's going to be able to do that here in Seattle.
Agreed. And that's something that you really got the sense of, when he was talking about it, was how big of an factor opportunity was. He mentioned, hey, I've been in the shadow of Ovechkin, Backstrom, McKinnon, Landeskog. And he mentioned, I want to have a bigger role. I want to play more, and I want to be a leader for the younger players and kind of show them the way. And I thought that was really telling too, because a player like Burakovsky, he's 27, the
Hmm.
first year of UFA, kind of right in the middle of that age group, right? You're
Yeah.
not exactly a younger guy anymore, but you're not in your 30s. You're not really the total elder statesman there, but wanting to transition to be more of a leader. And it's tough to do when you're, especially when he was, in his early 20s on those Capitals teams.
Yeah.
You can't really take a leadership role at, when you got Ovechkin, Backstrom, those are the guys, right?
Right.
And on that Colorado team, you have a lot of leaders there too. Nathan McKinnon for sure, Gabriel Landeskog. I mean, between those two, it's tough to kind of be one of the
Yeah.
main leaders of a team. Nothing wrong with those guys. They're great leaders, but you kind of have to be in the shadow a little bit. And I think it's something that Andre's really going to embrace coming to Seattle. And the Kraken, I think, see that for him as well. There's a reason they had such interest in him very early, is because he has everything that you would want for a player who's primed to break out both on and off the ice and become, play a bigger role in really every sense. And so that's something that he definitely feels that he has a chance to do and that he's excited to do.
Right. And this is a player who is, he's worn a lot of different hats in the NHL too. And I think that that's going to help him teach younger guys and all these players that are in different positions, right? I mean, he's going to come into a team where Matty Beniers needs to be shown stuff on how to be an NHL player, all that kind of stuff at a top line level. But you also have guys that are kind of struggling to still find their way, in like a Morgan Geeky, right, who's playing a more depth role, something like that, or a Cole Lind or somebody, one of those type of situations. But this is a guy who at 19 was able to crack a very good Washington Capitals roster, right? I don't think many people expected him to do that. And he did it by being, a depth role player type guy. And he just slowly progressed and worked his way up to the point where, hey, there's just not room for you here, right? Kind of thing. Moves over to Colorado, gets in a more expanded role there, proves that he can be more of a go-to scorer type thing, still contributes in the playoffs there, just like he did in Washington. So he has that experience too. But, it's the kind of guy that has really worked his way up through the system, done things the, quote unquote right way, all of those things, and he learns so many lessons along the way. And the one benefit of playing in Stars shadows, or in these leadership shadows of people like Ovechkin, Backstrom, Landeskog, is that you got to learn from them, and they are some of the best in the business. So now he gets to kind of take the wisdom he's picked up along his own journey, the wisdom he's been given from those guys, and impart it all on the Seattle Kraken. And I'm just super, super happy about that.
Agreed, and I think it's something that we're going to be looking very closely for as training camp gets started and everything, and the leadership situation almost kind of resets,
Yeah.
and you start to see that. And then the last thing on Burakovsky that I wanted to mention, he's pretty funny and candid too, and I like that about the presser. There were a few moments that kind of just got laughs from us, and just how candidly he speaks, which I really like, is refreshing. He was asked about that Avs Kraken game in November that we talked about on our best moments, a couple weeks ago on the podcast, and that was the game, of course, where the Avs went up 7-0, and then the Kraken got 3 more. But I'm sure he doesn't remember every single game. But yeah, they asked, like, okay, do you remember that one in November? And he's like, is that the one where I scored 2 goals, or the one we lost? Which I thought was a pretty funny response. He also, he wasn't shy about talking about how the ice maybe wasn't the best for the second game, and the guys were talking about that. But I like that that's the kind of thing that he would share too, where he's not going to necessarily hold anything back. I think that's gonna bode really well for us, just covering him and the team. You're gonna hear what he thinks, and I think that's something that all fans can really appreciate.
It for sure it is. I mean, we kicked off this podcast talking about marketability, personality, all this stuff, right? Here we get a player who has that. And it also tells me if he's comfortable enough talking to the media like that and about those things, then he's for sure comfortable enough talking within that locker room, talking to the coaching staff, talking to, Ron Francis, right? Like, it means he's confident, he knows what he's seeing, whatever, he believes in what he's seeing, and he believes in the messaging that he's going to take to somebody else. I think that that's very important within an organization too, as the Kraken continue to develop their own culture and what their identity is going to be internally. I think having guys like that who aren't afraid to speak their mind, who aren't afraid to go like, hey, you know what, ice, it's not really good right now, like maybe let's look at that, you know what I mean, let's see if there's something we can do there. I think that that's something that benefits an organization, when you have people willing to step up and say, hey, there's this issue over here, instead of just being like, yeah, but I don't want to bother them, you know what I mean? Because I feel like that's a lot of hockey too, especially when you're talking about a front office where it's, your general manager is Ron Francis, right? Like this super elite, did it all kind of guy in the NHL. I can see that being very intimidating for guys to go to him and maybe express a concern or something. But to have somebody like that in the locker room, I think that benefits everybody, someone who's willing to talk about those kinds of things. And then, yes, you talked about it, the media thing is certainly a big deal. I want to end Burakovsky kind of, let's just once again kind of go over what we think he's going to do this year. RJ, I could try to set a quick over under, but I think we've been pretty consistent talking about he's going to have every opportunity in the world to be on the top line. Got to think probably on the left side. I think that's kind of everybody's consensus opinion at the moment, is he'll be the first line left winger. What kind of production do you think we're going to see from him? Because, like I said before, in Washington, he was kind of just relegated to more of a depth role just because those rosters were kind of stacked. He wasn't quite able to move up just because there wasn't the opportunity. Goes to Colorado, playing time goes up pretty significantly minutes-wise. You're talking about, 2 to 3 minutes a game. That is definitely significant. And he starts producing 20 goals a year in shortened seasons, and 61 points last year in 80 games. So what kind of production do you think we're going to see out of him in his first year in Seattle?
This is tough because of all the players the Kraken brought in, Burakovsky, I think, might have the widest range of outcomes as far as production, because you can make a case both ways. That on the one hand, if he's averaging only 16 minutes a night in that last season in Colorado, which is not very much. I mean, those are third line minutes. So he's going to get a bump up from that significantly. But also, you look at the talent around him, and let's be honest, there's not as much in Seattle as there is in Colorado.
Mhm.
I think we could pretty safely say that. So there's, it could go either way. I think the goals, I would expect he had 22 last season. I would expect that to bump up to maybe 25, 26, or maybe higher if things go right for him. But I could see an increase in that. I think the assists totals might go down a little bit just given the finishing talent around him probably won't be the same as it was in Colorado. I think overall points wise, it could probably just about even out.
Mhm.
So I basically see it evening out production wise, but with it a lot more solid of a foundation, basically, where he doesn't have to be on a Stanley Cup, winning roster, and he's driving a lot more of that himself.
Yeah, and like you talked about, right? He's gonna have more ice time, all that stuff, but he doesn't have the protection of playing in lineups where the other team is really concerned with stopping an Ovechkin or stopping McKinnon, right? Like that is certainly a benefit to guys who play further down those lineups. The thing that I'm gonna be most interested in is so far we've seen this is a guy who's kind of an elite sniper from a shooting percentage standpoint, right? So he finishes his years in Washington with a 12.8% shooting percentage, which is very good. That is very good. And then he goes to Colorado, and over his 3 seasons there, 17.2%. Now, normally I'd just be like, I'd look at some of these years and go 19.4, completely unsustainable. 18.6, completely unsustainable. But the bottom line is, over 3 years, which is starting to get to a better sample size, it was 17.2 out of the average. It dropped to 14.8 his last year there, but his volume really went up. He had 149 shots compared to 103, 102 the years prior. So I think obviously the volume's going to go up in Seattle just because he's going to have even more minutes on the table. He's going to be playing in the top line role. You got to think he's going to be a featured part of the power play. So he should have 200 shots. I would think things are kind of going wrong if he doesn't at least have 200 shots at the end of the year. So I'll see his shooting percentage probably drop to back down to like 12%, 11.5 maybe if he really goes all out volume shooting. But I kind of want him to, like, similar to
Right.
McCann. We talked about this in the over under on McCann and stuff, and in things. I want these guys to kind of just turn into volume shooters. Beniers can be the setup guy, right, on this line. I want Burakovsky, I want Bjorkstrand, I want McCann. I want all these guys to just try to turn into volume shooters, particularly these guys like McCann and Burakovsky, who, even when they are more volume shooters, their shooting percentage still stays high. That tells me that 30 goals isn't unrealistic. Maybe not this year. You got to give the team another year to add more talent, let Beniers develop a full season, whatever. But over the length of his contract, it wouldn't surprise me if he could hit that number.
Agreed, and I'm glad you mentioned the shooting percentage still being quite high. Even
Mm-hmm.
if you get into that volume, if you're a real volume shooter and you're still at a 10, 11% clip, that's pretty good, and that can lead to a 30-goal season.
Yeah.
I think the key to for Burakovsky is just getting to those areas in the high slot too. He's got such a dangerous shot, but it's hard to get to those areas where you can unleash it. He's the kind of guy though who can score from a little bit further away too. And I could see if the chemistry works between him and Matty Beniers being able to set him up in those spots a lot. And that's why I see a real kind of high variance in how he could do, because you just don't know whether he's going to develop that chemistry with Beniers or not. We just haven't seen the two of them together.
Mm-hmm.
And turns out, hey, that might not work. Maybe he's better with a Gord or a Wenberg. And then can he get to those spots as much? You don't know. But if it does work out with Beniers, I think Beniers is the kind of creative player who can find Burakovsky in the high slot, where maybe it's a little bit further out for most players to score, but given his elite shot, he can really turn those shots into goals. So I think the upside is really high.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm just excited. Like I said, he just kind of flies under the radar so far through this off season. But every time he comes up for us, or I remember that the Kraken got him, I'm just like, wow, because there is an element of mystery, right? Like the next player we're going to talk about, we know exactly what Justin Schultz is going to come in and do. We know exactly what it is, right? We have a pretty good idea of like Bjorkstrand. We talked about him a lot. He's a player more familiar with, at least on my end, for a long period of time. But Burakovsky, like I'm with you. Every time we've talked about him, we've talked about that variance and what we think he can do. But the more I've really kind of looked at things, I'm starting to kind of feel like it's more and more. I feel like we did get a top tier free agent. You know what I mean? Who's going to be able to have that production? Like I said, maybe not year one, just because again the team is not great. Like we still know that playoff push is still going to be something they're going to really have to work for. It's not a given, but certainly over the length of this contract, I think he's going to deliver.
Yeah, agreed. All right, so moving on to the second player, we have another 2 Stanley Cup rings. By the way, there were 4 Stanley Cup rings in this presser between Burakovsky and Schultz. That's pretty impressive. But we have Justin Schultz, and the main thing I wanted to know relates to something that Ron Francis was talking about right back when Justin Schultz was signed. I believe it was the day of. We got him on the first day of free agency, and I asked Ron. I said, with this Justin Schultz signing, I know you were looking for a right-handed defenseman, maybe someone who could quarterback a power play. Is that need filled now, or are you still looking for things? Might that be another area you'd want to add? Basically trying to get it. Are you going after John Klingberg at the time? And they ended up not doing that. And Justin Schultz, I guess, will be that guy, the new addition that they're hoping to do that. But one thing that Ron said at the time was, look, Justin Schultz, when you talk about the power play, we've seen him in those spots, even though it hasn't been a lot of ice time there. You look at his previous teams, he was stuck behind guys like a Chris Letang or a John Carlson who were quarterbacking those top power play units. But when Schultz did get those opportunities, he did really well. And we even talked to guys in Pittsburgh, and they said they liked him in those spots. And so that's why we're confident that he can do that for us. So I wanted to ask Justin, how much of a factor was it really in signing here? Was that opportunity to quarterback a power play unit and to get that chance, whereas before, with Letang and Carlson, you weren't really able to do that? And also, what did you learn from those guys being on the same team? And Schultz did say that it was a big factor in coming here, of course, almost like, it's kind of obvious. Like, of course, I want this opportunity here running a power play, because I think it's something he knows he can do. But he just needs the opportunity to do it. And then he mentioned, of course, playing with guys like John Carlson and Chris Letang, you learn so much because they are some of the best power play quarterbacks in the league, in hockey, really. It's kind of what we talked about with Burakovsky and the leadership from an Ovechkin, McKinnon, Landeskog, those guys. Schultz has had similar opportunities to learn from Carlson and Letang about quarterbacking a power play.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's lots of positives there. Justin Schultz all along, right? His calling card has been being that puck moving, smooth skating, offensive defenseman, kind of just prototypical in that regard. And he's been able to do that every step of the way. There's been years where he's been able to kind of have more control of a power play. Think of 2016-17 in Pittsburgh and 17-18 in Pittsburgh, where he was, had a little bit more responsibility there. Early on he had it in Edmonton, but those were some terrible Oilers teams, so I don't know how much you could really pull from it. The one thing with him that is, I guess, kind of worrying to me is because he's going to be 32 this year. That's not too old or anything. You can start expecting maybe some decline there, but I don't think that it would be anything super significant. It's just that his ice time has been on the decline the last couple of years, and it really took a hit last year where he dropped below the 17-minute mark. He played the 6th most average ice time of anybody on that Capitals blue line. He was really buried on their depth chart last year. TVR was passing him up, RJ. Trevor Van Riemsdyk. Oof. Yeah, so you know what I mean? So that's something that's concerning to me. And, obviously spent a lot of time covering the Kraken and everything. Not a ton of time to watch Capitals games last year, so I don't really know what was going on there. I don't know if it was, the system changed there over the last couple of years, right, coaching-wise and everything, and he wasn't quite the same fit anymore. If they had young guys coming up and taking the spot kind of away from him, what was the reasoning for it? But that is something that concerns me a little bit, is that he's really slowly the last couple seasons, his ice time has been reduced. It was 40 seconds at first, then it was 50 seconds, and then this time it was 2 minutes. That's, what I mean? That's a trend that I'm not super happy to see when we're projecting him to walk in, and that's over both Pittsburgh and Washington. So it's not even just like one team situation. But it's a trend that I'm not like, that worries me a little bit when projecting him into a top 4 role potentially with the Kraken, just because they need that help on the right side. When talking about somebody who's going to come in and run the second unit power play, most likely, potentially move up to the first if Vince Dunn struggles, right? So I don't know. Like I said, I wish I knew more about that, but that's the thing that stands out to me as I've kind of dug a little deeper into Justin Schultz since the signing.
And that's the key. And that's another reason that I was kind of pressing Ron Francis on that at the time, is because it looked like there was still space, maybe. If you bring in, say, a Klingberg and then Schultz moves down to the third pair, and then all of a sudden, yeah, you can play him those third pairing minutes and he can thrive in that because it's a manageable role. And then you can put him in those more offensive situations too to really get, some bang for your buck there as far as, generating offense against probably lesser matchups, if you got third, fourth line stuff. But he's going to be trusted, it looks like, to play a bigger role than he has been. It's something he's done in the past, but can he get back to doing that? That's absolutely a big question that the Kraken have heading into training camp.
Yeah, and I still want to do like a Kraken power play video closer to training camp. August we really planned out with other stuff, but I think in September we'll have time to kind of do something like that and we can talk about it more. My question for you is, who do we think he's going to be paired with? Like, because that's, we kind of have it projected with Jamie Alexiak right now as that second pairing, him on the right side. But again, it's one of those things, the more I think about it, I don't know how him and Jamie Alexiak would fit style-wise. Like, I think Justin Schultz and Carson Soucy make more sense as a pairing, personally.
Right. Stylistically, yeah, Soucy probably meshes a little bit better with Schultz. It's going to be tough seeing kind of where to put Jamie Alexiak, because then projecting kind of what we have, you'd have Alexiak Borgen, and I don't know if I like that pairing really.
No.
And
Alexiak needs Alexiak needs the top 4 minutes and stuff. Like, you can't put Alexiak down. So, but then you're putting Schultz down to the third line, and what, Will Borgen's your second pairing? You know what I mean? Like, it defeats the purpose of bringing in Schultz. Like, it's going to be a tough one.
Right. And it's the kind of thing where I could see them shuffling things around a lot, especially early on, and just hoping that something sticks. I mean, maybe you go back to the Soucy Alexiak pair that they went with last season as your second pair, and then Schultz down to the third pair, and then you can't really pair him with Will Borgen. Borgen Schultz doesn't work.
Yeah.
Maybe you hope that a lefty is there. I don't know. And then, how does Michael Kempny fit into everything? It's a big question going into camp, and it's something we should keep an eye on.
Right, and that all assumes that, Dunn Larson is a for sure thing, and I don't know that is either. I think, last year we talked a lot about it throughout the course of the season, the fact that, like, all the forward lines, the top 3 forward lines were basically all played the same amount of time, and there wasn't really, a structured hierarchy of first line, second line, third line. It was just kind of like everybody's kind of together and everybody's kind of fluid and moving around, and and we know the issues that arose from that. I really think this year it's going to be more structured. There will be a first line, a second line, a third line, and a fourth line. But the more I look at this defense, I'm just starting to think, like, I think the defense is going to be pretty fluid for a while, and I think it's not going to be like first pair, second pair, third pair. It's going to be more like these 4 guys play about the same amount of minutes, and then maybe these guys get a minute or 2 less. But I think it's going to be, I don't know that we're going to really have like a first pair, second pair. I think situations might dictate what we see. Oh, we're defending a 1-goal lead late in the third period. Alexiak Larson, let's go. You know what I mean? Oh, we need a goal. Vince Dunn, Justin Schultz, let's go. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I could see that absolutely being situationally based. And you look at the forwards, and they really made some acquisitions there to kind of even everything out and get it to the point where you can have a first, second, third, fourth line. On D, as much as Schultz helps you because you needed that right-handed puck-moving defenseman, you just didn't bring in enough to really be able to move everyone to the point where they need to be.
Right. And the bottom line is also nobody separated themselves last year. That's the other thing, right? Like, everybody had an issue, regardless of what it was. And it was a significant enough of an issue that it kind of keeps you from being like lock it down, right? As much as I want to be all about like Larson, right? Oh, he's the one like surefire top pairing guy. He's the most do it all, whatever. But we do know that there are issues there, right? The underlying analytics are not as good for him as they are for someone like Alexiak, who had different struggles last year that were concerning, particularly later in the season. And Vince Dunn, who we talked about, he has the offensive flashes and he was picking up things on the defensive side, but also he really didn't take that step forward and really, plant his flag and say, this is mine. So it's going to be interesting. And I do think that the blue line is going to be the place this season where, we're going to spend the most amount of time talking as far as who should be with who, what's going on, what's working, what's not working. And, that's okay. It's another year. It's a heck of a process, the expansion draft and putting a roster like this together. And I guess I should just be focusing on the fact that the forward group seems so much more solid than last year. And that's going to help a lot.
It's going to be better than just, oh no, this team can't score.
Yes.
I'll take defense problems over that.
Agreed. So still excited. It's always good to add rings to the room, isn't it, RJ? We saw what Duncan Keith was able to do for Edmonton last year. Took him to a Western Conference final.
Yep, he did that.
Yep. He certainly didn't hold them back from maybe, threatening a Stanley Cup final.
Yep. So rings in the room.
Yep.
Always good.
Always good. All right. So let's transition from the locker room to the front office, RJ. So Kraken making some moves there again this week. I know one of them very much piqued your interest, so I want to try to get there as quickly as possible. Why don't you go ahead and fill everybody in if they haven't heard on what the Kraken are doing up top?
Yes, so the Kraken announced 3 new additions to their hockey ops team. Franz Nielsen, Justin Rye, and Doug Wilson Jr. So that's an interesting trio that we have there. Let's start with Nielsen and Rye, though, get those two out of the way. So they will be tasked with working with Kraken players and prospects both in North America and overseas, according to a team press release. So they'll be development consultants kind of working on the player development side of things. Franz Nielsen, we're familiar with him. He played 16 NHL seasons that spanned pretty much the length of our formative hockey years, right, Dylan?
Yeah.
And so I want to ask you, any Franz Nielsen memories that you have that maybe come to mind for you over his playing career?
Not really. Like towards the end, it was just one of those when he was with Detroit where it was just like, Detroit just was still always good and they were just finishing up this, like 20-year stretch of just being good and having these guys like him where it was just like, oh, your third line's going to come out and you're going to have this guy who can score, 17 goals. Great. Like it was more so like he was just like another name just that I associated with like this stupid team that's always winning.
Exactly. I mean, he was one of those kind of underrated guys that just those depth guys the Red Wings had that fueled a lot of their success. I liked his time with the Islanders because I would play with the Islanders, circling back to the very beginning in the NHL games, EA NHL video games. So I would enjoy playing with him there. He brought a lot of speed to my teams there. Yeah. And of course, got to mention this great bit of trivia that he's the first Danish citizen to play in the NHL. So, kind of a trailblazer for Danish players. There have been a lot since and kind of immediately since, really, including current Kraken Oliver Bjorkstrand. So that's cool to bring another Dane on board. It can never have too many of those. Mm-hmm. So Franz Nielsen, an interesting bit here. He will be based in Malmö, Sweden. So that kind of makes sense. If we pull the old map out, Malmö is in very southern Sweden, right? So it's just right across the water from the Danish capital of Copenhagen. So Nielsen, who is Danish, he'll be fairly close to home. And yes, I know he is from Herning, which is about a 3.5-hour drive away, but still fairly close to home in the grand scheme of things. And thanks again, Dylan, for sitting through me talking about geography for a little bit.
No, it's always good because that is where he played in Sweden before coming over to the NHL. So so it makes sense. Knows the area, knows the hockey, all that kind of stuff because it's a consultant kind of role, right? That he's going to have with the Kraken. Yeah. So
and so he'll be working with players and I think also prospects too. Yeah. I mean, the Kraken have a lot of prospects, that are in Europe, a lot of them in Finland, but that's, That's a flight away. You can do that where he could potentially work with those prospects too.
Exactly. So I like the idea of having somebody based over there who's your, you know, point of contact, someone who can be a point of contact just, for the team and everything, but also for the players there, right? Whether they've already been drafted by the Kraken or somebody who can keep an eye on, draft eligible guys or potentially players that you want to sign as an undrafted free agent, you know what I mean? And just kind of be in the hockey culture there, hearing the names that get brought up and the stories that go on, because that's so much of this. That's so much of scouting in certain places and things. So I think it's really, really intriguing. I was a little disappointed because I wanted him to be a consultant for the PK after his legendary 2010-2011 season, RJ, in which he had 7 shorthanded goals. Keep in mind, he only had 13 goals total that season, 7 shorthanded. I was like, can we just get him some like one-on-one time with Matty Beniers and teach him some of that magic, please?
Oh, absolutely. As a PK consultant, he would do quite well. I'm sure that's something he knows well. I mean, how many shorthanded goals do the Kraken have all season? What,
6, I
or all
think.
time, was it 8? I think it's something like
It's
8.
something
So
like that,
to
yeah.
get almost that amount in one season, pretty impressive.
Yeah, would it surprise you if I said that he led the league that year in shorthanded goals?
No, that would not surprise me at all.
Okay. So
All
yeah,
right.
I think it's a fun hiring.
Yeah, agreed. So good to have him on board. Welcome to the organization, Franz Nielsen. So the other development consultant the Kraken have is Justin Rye, who I learned shortly after the signing is cousins with former Seattle Thunderbird Prob Rye. So I actually do remember him from, I don't know, just following hockey or whatever. I remember that name, probably some hockey cards that I had back in the day. But yeah, former Seattle Thunderbird. Justin Rye, though, he was the owner and operator of Kaivo Hockey, which is a skill development consultancy whose clients include current NHLers and top prospects. So when you talk about development and being, a developer for the Kraken, if you had a skill development consultancy who was working with NHLers, that's pretty good qualifications.
Yeah, I mean it sounds like you got exactly what you were looking for if that's what you were looking for, right?
Yep. So, welcome him to the organization and a cool little connection to
Hmm.
Seattle. A
Yeah,
cousin who played for the Thunderbirds.
yeah.
That's pretty cool.
What
Yeah,
I was
go
gonna
ahead.
say, real quick, what skills do you think he's gonna do? August, it's still August. We got to project all this stuff. What do you think the number one
Okay.
thing that they'll have him work on is?
I
What skill?
don't know. Do you have anything in mind?
I have
Are
no
you looking at
clue.
his stat lines from
I,
when he
I
played
in the
college
BCHL. I
hockey?
know.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure it out. I have no clue. It's kind of intriguing because there's there's a lot of you know there's a lot of open-endedness in the
Mhm.
quote you had just read. So that's why I'm like, I want to know more. I'm curious. I'm intrigued by this because you don't often hear of teams bringing in skills consultants. Normally it's like, oh, that's what our coaching staff is for. But I think that this is actually something that is needed because coaching staffs are busy with other things. So
Exactly, and it's the kind of forward-thinking, hire that I would expect the Kraken, to make to try and really fill out these skill development roles, which I know other teams have that too. But there's no salary cap for these guys. You can bring in a
mm-hmm.
lot of talented people to help develop your players, and I think it's good that the Kraken are doing that. A lot of teams still will just kind of bring in former players to kind of hang around, like former players of their team to kind of hang
Mm-hmm.
around and do that. But if you're the Kraken, you've got to think outside the box a little bit. You don't really have former retired Kraken players who are ready to do that for you. So, I like them bringing him on board.
Well, one of the things that comes up when you Google him is this picture of him shirtless on a boat, and this dude is jacked, like just
Okay, well, that's a good
shredded.
sign, right?
So if that's the skill, I guess sign the Kraken up.
Absolutely. Everyone showed up to training camp just shredded. Let's
Yep,
go. All
let's do
right.
it.
So the final of the three hockey ops hires, and this is probably the one I have the most to
Mm-hmm.
say about, is Doug Wilson Jr. So you may remember that name, Doug Wilson. His father, Doug Wilson Sr., was the general manager of the San Jose Sharks for a long time before, parting ways with the organization this offseason. And again, hope he's doing all right. We know there's some kind of unspecified health issues there, but hoping the best for him. So Doug Wilson Jr. He ran basically essentially ran the Sharks scouting department and drafts from 2017 on until he left the organization along with his father following this year's draft. Um, but he kind of came up in the Sharks organization. I mean, he was the son of an NHL general manager. He was around hockey all the time growing up. And so, he got a lot of exposure to the game. And essentially what he did for the Sharks is he kind of modernized the Sharks scouting department. Now, before him, it was run by Tim Burke, who was more of an old school style scout. I mean, Dylan, you know that scout meeting scene in Moneyball where you have
Yes.
all the older scouts talking, like, oh, he's got a hot girlfriend, so he's clearly confident we should draft him. And Billy Bean's, looking at this like, what?
Yeah.
So Doug Wilson Jr. basically came in there and said, okay, let's look at who gets on base.
Yes.
Now, in 2017, there's nothing really revolutionary about that,
No.
but bringing the Sharks scouting and drafting into the 2010s was something that really needed to be done, and I think something he did successfully.
Yeah, and it is funny that you brought that up, because to bring things full circle to the beginning of the pod, when I was talking about that Ducks ice rink where the WHL have the combine and stuff, in that 2017 draft, actually drafted in the 6th round, 159th overall, Jake McGrew, who I scouted and saw at that WHL combine that year. And I was gonna say, you talk about the scene in Moneyball and the old-timey scouts or whatever. It's like, yes, RJ, I very much know what you're talking about. I was there with them. I've been around
That's
it.
true. Exactly. So Doug Wilson Jr., kind of marked a departure there from that line of thinking for the Sharks. And it was successful for the Sharks for a long time, kind of when everyone in the league was doing that. And the Sharks really, did the legwork in scouting, especially in Europe for a long time. But at a certain point, you need someone with, I think, more of an asset management like Doug Wilson Jr., that background. And especially with trading up and down, he's was in charge more of trading down than the Sharks like to do in the past, which I liked, of course. We've seen that can tend to bring value. You get more dart throws that way. And I think most pronounced was the Sharks in this year's draft, trading down from, what was it, 11 or 12 to get 3 picks, that were kind of at the end of the first, start of the second round. You look at his draft track record with the Sharks from 2017 to 2022. And I think it's fair to say there's mixed results. That first draft, I think he did a really good job. And you could see the difference between the draft beforehand, where in 2016, where he wasn't running things, Dylan Gambrell, Noah Gregor, Emmanuel Wiederer, Mark Shoemaker, Joachim Blickfeld. That's a very Tim Burke type draft there. And then you have Doug Wilson Jr. taking over, and you get Josh Norris in the first round, who's turned into a great player for the Ottawa Senators. Mario Ferraro, who was viewed as a little bit undersized in the second round. That's kind of one of the reasons that he fell, but he has turned out to be a fantastic defenseman for the Sharks. So that kind of thinking too, which we know the Kraken buy into, right? With the Riker Evans pick, undersized defenseman Ty Nelson. That's the kind of thinking that they're very much into. So I see the fit there. With Doug Wilson Jr., it wasn't all good. You look at the next draft and Ryan Merkley in the first round, who I'll let you talk about in a little bit. But I think it goes to basically this philosophy of going for higher upside players and trying to swing for the fences in the first round, which I'm very much in favor of.
Yes.
But what do you think, looking at this draft record as a whole from Doug Wilson Jr.?
I think some of the struggles that I think he had in the years, the drafts where things weren't great, weren't necessarily all his fault anyway, right? Hands are tied at some point. 2019, you don't have a first round pick, right? Like, it's, that just makes it harder to have a successful draft, because guess what? Most of the time, the NHL players that make it are in the first round. Who would have thought, right? And so when you don't have something like that, it makes things difficult. You don't have a high second rounder either. You have 2 seconds. It's like 48 and 55th. That being said, to only get 1 NHL game out of those 2 picks is not, you'd like it to be better, but like, I'm willing to give you the pass there. After that, it's kind of early, right? Like 2022 is way too early to really judge that draft class. 2021, it's mostly still too early to judge that draft class. Again, didn't have a second round pick. The Sharks for some of those years, right, we're still making deals all that kind of stuff going around. You mentioned Josh Norris being with the Senators, right? He's not helping out the Sharks right now. He's probably Doug Wilson Jr.'s best draft pick. So again, but you can't hold that against Doug Wilson Jr. He drafted him. That after that, it's out of his hands.
That's all you can do.
Yeah, it's out of his hands. But William Eklund was a fantastic grab. You could debate whether or not that was just like the obvious choice, like, oh wow, he fell to you, so you have to grab him. But still, the point is, you grabbed him. We've seen teams pass on guys who fall to them. Shane Wright, right? Like we just saw that. So, I think that was a good draft. The 2021 is the one that's going to be the most interesting to me, and I think we're going to learn the most about it this year, having been 2 years out from it and stuff. Thomas Bordeleau, I just talked about him in my World Junior wrap-up video. This is a guy who just puts up points. Like, that's just what he does. I couldn't necessarily tell you how he does it, but he does it. So that's, but I like those players. It's good. And already he's got 5 assists in 8 NHL games. That's not bad. But
another player who fell to the second round because he was undersized.
Exactly. So I do like that kind of thing. Obviously, going back to the Portland philosophy that I learned and kind of had, and made me a fit there, about choosing hockey sense and hockey smarts and just the guys that produce. If they're finding a way of producing, and they find a way of producing at an elite level for wherever they're at, whether that's in the NHL, WHL, or, Bantam, they just tend to keep that. Guys just keep that, and they'll get passed over because they're undersized. But the bottom line is, if they're scrappy guys, if they're smart players, they find ways of producing. And I've always liked that philosophy. I think that the teams that have that philosophy end up, on a whole, being more consistent and they're more consistent at being above average. I won't necessarily say they're always the best teams, but I feel like rarely those are the teams that are like, oh wow, they're picking in the top 5 again. You know what I mean? Like, you don't talk about teams like that very often. And so I like bringing in somebody who has that philosophy when drafting, in Doug Wilson Jr. I'm very much in favor of that. That being said, there's some head scratchers in here. Don't understand the Ryan Merkley pick in 2018. I don't know what he was seeing, really. I think a lot of people were putting more offensive, skill on him than he kind of really had. I know he had displayed it those previous 2 seasons, but he fell off pretty quick from there and just hasn't made it work since. It was just one of those guys that, I don't know, I just never got good vibes from. This Aussie, what was it, Weisblatt?
Yep.
Yeah. Don't quite get it, and it's another one where he gets drafted, and talk about falling off a cliff after being drafted. The production has just disappeared completely for him. So, don't totally know what's going on there. Again, kind of an undersized guy, but not really a player that was super inspiring. You know what I mean? And so that's
on the ice. Yes. Although I will have
Yes.
to say the inspiring moment
Yes.
of drafting him and Doug Wilson Jr. You might remember him, if you're a hockey fan, that it goes that far back, you might remember him seeing on TV, signing Ozzy's name so that his deaf brother could kind of participate in that whole draft process, which was a fantastic moment. But yeah, on the ice, not as inspiring, the results.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where it's, that's the fine line you walk with the small guys, right? The undersized guys is, if they don't have that special spark that's going to let them just, go at every level, then it's just not going to be there for them. And so that's the only concern I really see. But, we saw this year, especially with the Kraken, you brought up Ty Nelson, Jagger Firkus, right? Can't get more undersized than Jagger Firkus, and yet we're all super pumped to have him, and he's a guy who for sure finds ways of producing just with his smarts and his ability to read defenses. So I think Doug Wilson Jr. is going to fit right in, especially because he's only going to be a scout. He's not in charge of the draft.
And that's what I was going to say. I'm curious how, as a scout, his role will change. Because from what I was able to gather with his time in San Jose, he was almost kind of in charge of the grand strategy of the draft. Yes, there was a scouting element to it, but he would kind of be the one to listen to the scouts as the director of scouting. You can't be everywhere at once. No. You have to listen to your different scouts, and I'm sure as director of scouting, he knew that better than anyone. That he can't see everything. You have to trust in what your scouts are seeing. But at the end of the day, it's your call, and you get to decide. Okay, who are we taking at the end of the day? Are we moving up? Are we moving down? Who are we trying to get? So it's going to be a different role as an amateur scout. Now you're one of the scouts who has to go compile that data, figure out who you like, and then report it to, like maybe Robert Cron, who's running the draft for the Kraken, or Ron Francis, report it to them. So I think it's something that kind of can fill out his resume a little bit, but it's a different type of job.
Right. And that's something that, if, as somebody who wants to focus on trying to find those high skill but maybe undersized players, that role suits you way better, because those are the kinds of things to separate the Borlos from the Weisblets is just viewing. You need time to see them, and see them in different situations against different types of systems, against different types of opponents, big opponents, fast opponents, all that kind of stuff, because that's when you're going to notice, like, okay, this guy adjusts his game every time. He can read what the other team's doing and he just finds a way of beating it, versus the guys that, hey, in those 2 games it just happened to line up really well for his skill set that I saw of him, so great. You know what I mean? And so I think that that's something that would help him out a lot more, being in just a scouting role.
Agreed.
So yeah, it's going to be super interesting. At the end of the day, I'm excited about it. It's another scout. I'm just excited to have a team that, invests in that, right? Like, there are still NHL teams that, like, just refuse to invest in scouting departments. And it's just kind of mind blowing when it's like, it's relatively cheap compared to some of the other things you're investing in. And it's the thing that, more so than anything, is going to determine your on-ice product at the end of the day over a long period of time.
And that's one thing I hope we continue to see from the Kraken, is they're always trying to bring in new talented people, to fill in these positions and just add to their staff. I think the Kraken have this organizational philosophy: if you can never have too many good people in the organization, find a way to make it work at whatever role. And I think, this is a big part of that. You take someone who was the director of scouting for an NHL team and you're able to bring him in as just an amateur scout, just another voice that you have. I mean, why wouldn't you do it?
Exactly. And I know that there's some people who believe, in business or whatever, that you don't want to do that because you'll end up with conflicting opinions and friction and conflict and whatever. But I really think that when it comes to things like scouting in particular, you want that. The times where you have, like, 2 people who very passionately believe in 2 different players and they're going to argue about it, you're going to really learn which player you want in that moment, right? As those scouts are really digging deep to talk about why they like them and whatever. Those were always the moments where I felt like I could make the best case scenario, or it would hit me that, you know what, this argument isn't really strong and maybe he's not the guy. You know what I mean? Like, and those moments only come out when you really have to step out on a limb for a guy, right? Like, I guess kind of went through that with Kamel this draft, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just all the comments from people, especially after the mock draft, having him go to the Flyers or whatever. But it made me strengthen my argument. It made me kept going back to the film and seeing, like, okay, is there something I'm missing? How does he handle these situations where he's the undersized guy or whatever? And it makes you view them that much more thoroughly and compile your argument for that player that much more so. And I think that ends up benefiting the draft as a whole, because, if there's the scout that has the really solid argument versus the scout with not the solid argument, I think you're going to end up with the better player most of the time.
Yep. And you look at some of the worst run teams, and especially from a scouting and drafting perspective,
Yep.
It's an echo chamber.
Yep.
You look at some of the videos that they put out of the scouting room, everyone's in agreement.
Yep.
And it's usually a small group of people.
Yeah. I'll go back to, in, like, the early 2010s, Carolina, I always felt like, had one of the best scouting departments. They sneakily had one of the best, like, funded scouting departments, and they had the best guy running it. And that was one of the things that I always took away from the brief, like, behind the scenes glimpses that they would give, is, like, everybody was always arguing in their scouting room. But you know what? Like, the Carolina Hurricanes, they drafted pretty well during those years. They found lots of guys that way. So I always thought it was good, but they did have a solid, strong figure at the top who was able to just say at some point, all right, enough, I've heard enough, and just pick a name. You know what I mean? And you do need that in those situations. You don't want anarchy, but I think that the Kraken have plenty of people capable of doing that.
Sure.
All right. So, boy, that turned into a lot more in-depth scouting-ish stuff than I thought it was going to.
Yeah, for sure. I thought I was going to be just talking about Doug Wilson Jr. the whole time. I'm glad you were able to, chime in. We were able to get to that scouting place. Hopefully, you all learned something there. That it's, always good to know, get that insight from you, Dylan, like just about how the scouting rooms work and all that. I certainly learned something listening to that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, hopefully I made a good coherent case for it. I worry sometimes when I get like kind of worked up, I just ramble too much. But yeah, and then
hey, if he didn't, let him know.
Yes,
and
please.
then he can refine that argument and get better. And
I'll watch the tape.
Exactly. We can have a better podcast room as a whole.
Yeah, and no need to look back at Doug Wilson's first draft in charge in 2017 to find the one player who didn't make the NHL. Jake McGrew. In all fairness, I'm not sure I had him in my top 10. So, or if I did, he was low top 10. I'll have to dig that out. That would be fun for people. Maybe we'll make that like a Patreon exclusive. My old things. Everybody can look at where they ended up.
Oh, that'd be fun. I like that idea.
Yep, and that's our segue into letting everybody know October Patreon's coming back.
Yes, it is, and we've got a lot of new stuff for you, so we're looking forward to telling you all about that as we get closer.
Exactly, and then for the true finish, I want to ask everybody this question, then we'll address it during the cold open on the next deep dive. Okay?
All right.
Because we've brought them up plenty already in this video, RJ. The Portland Winterhawks, New Jerseys, kind of taking some inspiration from somewhere familiar to us on this Kraken-centric podcast. And so I want to know from all the listeners, let us know whether it's in the comments on YouTube, again, Discord, Twitter, let us know because I want to talk about this to start off the next podcast. Did the Winterhawks steal the Kraken's jerseys? Straight up. What are your thoughts about it? How do you feel about it? Do you feel like they took something that belongs to the Seattle-based area? Do you think that they look good? How you feeling about it? I'm really curious because this is something that's a little, near and dear to my heart. So
that's for sure. I mean, it's the ultimate crossover between your two teams you've been most involved with. So yeah, everyone, let us know what you think. I'm really interested to see what the community has to say about it and to talk with you about it on the next podcast.
Yeah. So with that, everybody, it's a nice little teaser. I feel like we don't do that enough. We'll see you all